Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Lucía Robisco Alonso. I am PhD student conducting a research under the title Una aproximación filosófica al hacer cómico, reírse de una misma, a philosophical approach to comic performance, laughing about oneself, at the Complutense University of Madrid. I would like to express my gratitude to the organizing committee and the scientific board of this conference for accepting my poster and providing me with the opportunity to share this reflection. Likewise, I appreciate the presence of those listening and welcome any comments or reference that couldn't reach the discussion. For this presentation, I will limit the phenomenon of comedy to the genre of stand-up comedy. I focus on this format not only due to its cultural relevance, but also because it provides an exclusively comedic space with significant disruptive potential. Stand-up comedy has a well-established and extensive history in the United States and has become deeply embedded in its popular culture. In Spain, however, its introduction was comparatively late and somewhat artificial. In 1999, the private television network Channel Plus launched the program El Club de la Comedia, which marked the beginning of greater visibility for the genre in the country. At that time, Spain had a rich tradition of humor that like comedians specialized in stand-up. To fill this gap, teams of writers were specifically trained to compose stand-up monologues. This starting point gave rise to the first generation of Spanish stand-up comedians, contributing to the genre evolution into what is today a widely practiced artistic discipline. Currently, many well-known comedians in Spain media are starting their careers on stand-up stage, and in cities like Madrid and Barcelona, open mic spaces have multiplied, where both amateur and established comedians test and refine their material lightly. The objective of this presentation is encapsulated in its title, Rethinking the Gaze. While this objective can be hinted from the title, it might also appear somewhat ambiguous. To clarify it, let us turn to the gaze as a metaphor. The metaphorical association between seeing and knowing, the idea that seeing is understanding, is deeply rooted in our everyday language. Jost Lakoff, in his well-known work Metaphors We Live By, identifies how this conceptual structure manifests in common linguistic expression. According to Lakoff, three predominant metaphors shape our understanding. Understanding is seen, ideas are like source, and discourse is a like medium. Common phrases such as "I see what you're saying," "it looks different from my point of view," or "now I got the whole picture," illustrate how we conceptualize knowledge through vision. This expression reinforces a link between visual and intellectual clarity. Phrases like "that's an useful idea," "the argument is clear," or "the discussion was opaque," highlight how the metaphor of vision structures our understanding of the world. From the perspective of feminist epistemology, this metaphor has been interpreted to challenge traditional forms of knowledge, particularly those based on claims of universal objectivity. Here, Platon's eyes of the soul, which represent knowledge detached from context, paves the way to localize and situate perspective. Thinkers such as Sandra Harding have developed the concept of standpoint theory, which in Spain is translated as theory of the point of view. While scholars like José Medina have worked on the notion of epistemic blindness, showing how privileged social location can distort one's perception of oppressive structure. This idea helps us understand knowledge not as a neutral or universal, but as an arguing, a situate and localized. The epistemic approach has sparked significant debates in disciplines such as scientific research, where concepts like objectivity and neutrality have historically held considerable weight. However, in comedy, the landscape is different. Unlike science, comedy, particularly stand-up, does not aspire to neutrality, but is instead will upon personal perspective. Practical guides for writing stand-up comedy, such as Judy Carter's The Comedy Bible, explicitly state that a comedian's success largely depends on offering an authentic and unique perspective on the world. In this sense, what may be controversial in scientific discourse finds a fertile ground in comedy. One example is the epistemic privilege of the marginalized standpoint. In the comic space, as scholar and comedian Joan Gilbert explains, the rhetorical construction of marginality on stage requires the comedian to highlight aspects that position them as other in relation to their audience. Gilbert argues that within the context of contemporary stand-up comedy, the cumulative nature of performed marginality is apparent. That is, the more marginal the performer, the greater the potential for comic commodification on these features. Now, given that comedy does not claim neutrality in the way scientific disciplines often do, what is important to problematize the comedian gaze through feminist epistemology? To address this, I turn to the work that directly inspired my presentation title, Pensar, la mirada, un reto antropológico pendiente, Rethinking the Gaze, an Unresolved Anthropological Challenge, by anthropologist Lourdes Méndez. Méndez distinguishes between observation as method and the gaze as an interpretative act structured by cultural biases. She identifies the paradigmatic biases, ethnocentrism, androcentrism, and classism. Méndez analysis suggests that audiences do not see reality directly through their own eyes, but rather through the eyes of the anthropologist. Following her example, no matter how much the anthropologist Malinowski sought to capture the native's point of view, the eyes through which we perceive the native point of view is not the native, but of Malinowski himself. Like the anthropologist, the comedian also relies on observation. Practical guides to stand-up comedy define joke structure through premise and punchlines. The premise consists of a truthful statement based on the comedian's observation of the world, while the punchline introduces an unexpected twist that subverts the original expectation. Comedians, as observers of the world, select and present and interpret their reality, structuring it comically and inviting the audience to see through their eyes. In fact, audience engagement with a comedian vision is crucial for eliciting laughter. As Andrea Greenwald's ethnographic study concludes, stand-up comedy is an inherently rhetorical discourse. It strives not only to entertain but to persuade, and stand-up comic can only be successful in their craft when they can convince an audience to look at the world through their comic vision. In this sense, the lack of reflection on the gaze and the ways of seeing in anthropology, as highlighted by Méndez, proves to be applicable to research in comedy. Comedy professionals contribute to the expansion of the comic phenomenon by broadening our perception of what can elicit laughter or amusement. In this regard, Agnes Heller's study is particularly relevant. In this work, she examined existential comedy as an example of how the comic space was extending into new domains in the mid-20th century. Notably, as Heller emphasized, this expansion is not merely thematic. The question is not what these works are about, but how. It is from this perspective that I aim to highlight the importance of rethinking the comic vision, to critically examine the lens through which we expand the comic phenomenon. In this endeavor, I found revealing insight in a case study that I consider to some extent disruptive within the contemporary stand-up comedy landscape, Nanette by Hannah Gadsby. In 2018, the Australian comedian Hannah Gadsby premiered her stand-up special Nanette on the streaming platform Netflix. In this show, she problematized fundamental elements of stand-up comedy. In this sense, as philosopher Mark Rakowski suggests, we can regard Nanette as an exercise of philosophical reflection on the art of comedy. Gadsby argues that comedy has had a negative impact both on her personal life and on those who identify themselves with her, thereby questioning the supposed therapeutic benefits of self-deprecating humor. This reflection complicates the interaction between comedy and power, particularly by calling into question its critical and liberating potential. In her own words,
I do think I have to quit comedy though. And seriously, it's probably not the forum to make such an announcement, is it? In the middle of a comedy show, but I have been questioning, this whole comedy thing. I don't feel very comfortable in it anymore. For the past year I've been questioning it and reassessing, and I think it's healthy for an adult human to take stock, pause, and reassess. And when I first started doing the comedy over a decade ago, my favourite comedian was Bill Cosby. There you go. It's very healthy to reassess, isn't it? And I built a career out of self-deprecating humour. That's what I've built my career on. And I don't want to do that anymore. Because do you understand? You understand what self-deprecation means when it comes from somebody who already exists in the margins? It's not humility. It's humiliation. I put myself down in order to speak, in order to seek permission to speak. And I simply will not do that anymore, not to myself or anybody who identifies with me.
I believe this issue points to a personal resentment of the limits of Gatsby's own comedic lens. Her comedy has often incorporated stereotypes related to her sexuality, as well as prejudice associated with her gender expression and body image. However, this comedic self-representation contrasts with a statement in her autobiographical writings, where she asserts, "The construct of beauty that dominates my life experience has nothing to do with my life experience. The construct of beauty that I have to negotiate is an invention born out of the colonized eyes of the Western patriarchy. I have never identified with how people see me. I have a great big universe of stuff inside of me. None of it is gender. None of it. I love who I am. It's only on the other side of my skin where the pains begin. But I will not negotiate anymore. I am proud to be queer." This statement, "I will not negotiate anymore," can be understood as a refusal to continue commodifying her social position through comedy within the colonized gaze of the Western patriarchy, even if it remains economically profitable. However, Gatsby has not abandoned comedy. Following the success of Nanette, they continue to perform stand-up shows. They released Douglas, in which they disclose their autism diagnosis, followed by Something Special, where they delve into their experience with marriage. They continue making jokes about her life, but in a different way. These reflections do not seek to condemn the use of self-deprecating humor, but rather to complicate it by drawing on the conceptual resource offered by certain epistemological approach. In this case, the focus is on the how, the ways of seeing, rather than merely on the what. The Spanish translation of self-deprecating humor as humor autocrítico loses the negative connotation in the shift from deprecation to critique. I would like to research laughter about oneself as a form of self-writing in comedy terms. In this sense, the act of laughing about oneself could be understood as an epistemic project, one that demands an effort to comprehend and transform the knowledge one has of oneself in relation to others. Feminist epistemology have already provided productive metaphors such as epistemic blindness and epistemic lucidity, which can serve as useful conceptual tools in this discussion. This blindness affects not only the representation of the other, but also the perception of ourselves. I find Medina's framework particularly relevant to comedy performance, as it allows us to ask how one can cultivate awareness of one's own ignorance, an exercise he refers to as metalucidity. Furthermore, it raises the question of how we can generate epistemic friction in others. Both aspects seem crucial for understanding the turning point in Hannah Gatsby's work. For Medina, lucidity manifests first in the appreciation of the multiplicity of perspectives and the limitation of one's own standpoint, and second in the recognition of the specific features of those perspectives with which one's own is entangled. From this perspective, Nanette could be understood in Medina's theoretical terms as a cognitive and affective improvement for Gatsby, one that emerged from her recognition of the limitation of her comedy viewpoint. Regarding the generation of epistemic friction in others to expose their own ignorance and expand their sensitivity, Medina offered two approaches, one more destructive pessimist and the other more constructive optimist. The choice between this strategy depends on the specific social context. In certain oppressive environments, the only viable form of resistance may be through the most disruptive strategy. In the realm of comedy, this manifests in the exaggerated embodiment of stereotypes as a way to confront audience with the absurdity of their prejudice. This approach is often more effective at eliciting laughter, as it appeals both to those who perceive the absurdity of their vice and those who experience their confirmation and normalization. However, it is important to consider, as Medina warns, that when the balance of perspective is skewed in favor of dominant cultural ideas, self-contempt may arise. This dynamic can invert the destructive potential of the strategy, directing back towards the comedian, which seems to align with the experience Gatsby narrates. Meanwhile, Medina, following closely the philosopher Linda Koff, associated a more constructive path with the creation of a new identity structure as a means of agency. In Nanette, Gatsby appears to embrace this second, more constructive form of resistance, offering an explicit critique while simultaneously reshaping her comedic persona. I believe that the challenge posed by anthropologist Lourdes Méndez to look with new eyes holds great relevance for comedy, as it points to the possibility of expanding the comic phenomenon in directions that are more epistemically responsible and fair. In this regard, the comedic evolution of Hannah Gatsby could serve as an explicit example of such a shift. Through Gatsby's reflection, we can reconsider laughing about oneself as an epistemic endeavor, one that demands a restatement of how we come to understand and portray ourselves in relation to others. In this task, feminist epistemology provides valuable conceptual tools, urging us to rethink the gaze through which comedy is expanded. Thank you so much.